We continue reading in Ruth chapter 2. Ruth, working in the fields of Boaz, has been shown favor, hesed, by Boaz, and Boaz takes steps to reward and protect her. Beginning with verse 14, at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves, and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. What would it mean for Ruth to have food left over in this setting? Do you think Boaz would have reacted to all women the way he reacts to Ruth? What do we see about Boaz? How should we interpret Boaz showering Ruth with gifts? Why might the men be tempted to rebuke Ruth? Continuing to read, she carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave to her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed is the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I work with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all the grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work with him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." An ephah is 30 to 50 pounds. Commentators differ. Apparently, a field worker might receive 1 to 2 pounds of ration for his work in the fields, or her work. So this is quite a large amount of barley, possibly as much as a month's worth. Notice that in addition to bringing back the ephah of grain, Ruth also gives her mother-in-law her leftover portion from lunch. What is the storyteller saying about the relationship between Ruth and Naomi? The Hebrew phrasing employs a dramatic technique which is carried over in the English translation. Ruth delays the name of her benefactor to the very end of the sentence. There's mentioned the kinsman redeemer. In Hebrew is apparently the word goel, a relative who, according to Hubbard, had the responsibility to repurchase property once owned by the dead relative but sold in the time of need, purchase out of slavery relatives who had sold themselves due to poverty or need, avenge the killing of a relative by tracking down the murderer, receive money paid in restitution for a wrong committed against a dead relative, assist the relative in legal matters in lawsuits. Apparently, the Goel might also be expected to marry the widow of the deceased relative and take care of her children. Question from this passage: how is Boaz showing kindness to the dead? Do you think Naomi has some ideas with the phrase, "Blessed be the man who took notice of you"? Or am I reading too much into this? We finished chapter 2 with, "So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law." The barley and wheat harvest took about a month each, probably beginning in April and continuing into June. As the storyteller says, "And she lived with her mother-in-law," and maybe starts to rise from his seat, or her seat. Can you hear the audience say, "Wait, wait, you're not done"? Once again, the storyteller simultaneously summarizes the story and teases us about the future. We know now that Ruth has continued to work with Boaz, but now that the harvest is over, what's going to happen next? If this were a Hallmark movie, we'd go to commercial, because everyone knows something's about to happen. So for next time, read chapter 3 and enjoy it. The tension builds further between Ruth and Boaz in the strange and romantic scene on the threshing room floor. The audience cries out for the couple to succeed and chews its nails as complications arise. Will Yahweh really bless, finally, Ruth and Naomi and Boaz? As you read chapter 3, think about this. Why must Ruth do everything she is told? Isn't the scene on the threshing floor a little risque, a little forward? Ruth slips into bed with Boaz. What do you think was going through Ruth's mind after Boaz's promises in the dark? Did she sleep? Did she pray? Did she talk quietly to him? Next week, we will look more closely at chapter 3.